newspapermen meet such interesting people. They know the lowdown, now it can be told. I'll tell you quite reliably off the record about some charming people I have known. For I meet politicians and grafters by the score, killers plain and fancy, it's really quite a bore. Oh, newspapermen meet such interesting people. They wallow in corruption, crime and gore. Ting-a-ling-ling, city desk, full the press, extra, extra, read all about it, it's a mess, meets the test. Oh, newspapermen meet such interesting people. It's wonderful to represent the press. Now you remember Mrs.
The Media Project is a half hour of commentary and analysis on what's going on in the news media. Thank you for joining us. I'm Rex Smith of the Upstate American, formerly editor of the Times-Union, your host here. And let me introduce my colleagues for show number 1701. We've crossed over 1,700 Media Project shows over the last 3
I got tired around 1693.
So is that when?
Yeah, so I'm not sure if I can make it through the rest of this hour. The show's an hour now.
No, Ira. That's Ira Fussfeld, formerly editor of the Kingston Daily Freeman and affiliated publications, yes.
Does it feel like an hour?
It always feels like an hour.
Barbara Lombardo, formerly executive editor of the Saratogian and the Record in Troy, and Judy Patrick being uncharacteristically silent here.
No smart aleck comments from me.
Oh, no, not of course.
The show is young.
Judy Patrick, formerly editor of the Daily Gazette, and at 1,701 shows would begin our first show of the year 2024. So how about that? You know, it might not be a bad time then, as we weigh our weariness here, folks, to talk about journalism burnout. An interesting article written by a thoughtful person at the Poynter Institute, the journalism think tank, Kristen Hare, talks about how journalism burnout is a fact. And it does concern us, I think. It should concern us because a burned out journalist is a less effective journalist, somebody who perhaps won't make the extra phone call to get the full range of truth, will write something easy and untrue. Yet, how do you fight that when the pace of work in a newsroom can often be debilitating?
There's so many things we're asking reporters and editors to do. They don't just have to write stories or produce content for radio or television. They have to be on social media. They have to do filming. The other problem with burnout is they leave the profession. And we're losing people because our pay is not good, but the demands on our journalists today are incredible. And I think they are heaviest on the editors. Those are the people that have to make these hard decisions about what to cover in a shrinking news staff. And they want to do the best job they can, but they do not have the resources. I think that's an overlooked group oftentimes, and I think we need to pay greater attention to their needs, especially the frontline editors. I really feel sorry for them, and I wish there was more I could do to help.
Define, by the way, frontline editors. What do you mean? What's that term?
I mean the people who are actually at the desk making decisions about what to cover when. Also the editors who are making decisions about if I have to cut a reporter, which reporter goes, or what bureau do I close, or how do I make a decision about covering this event over this event? They've always made those kind of decisions, but those decisions are so enormously more difficult now than they were 10 years ago.
Giving me flashbacks here, PTSD. Come on.
Are we limiting the journalism burnout to print journalism, or as it's described today, or are we talking about radio stations,
yeah,
TV?
Talk about
it's
that.
not just the obvious reason that they burn out among print journalists, as it is because of so many layoffs and fewer people doing what used to be done by many more people. But it's not just print, it's not just digital. The pressure on journalists has always been significant. You always are writing or broadcasting under a deadline, knowing that your boss is looking right over your shoulder and your listeners and readers are right there too. And every story you write might be the last if you don't fulfill an expectation of you.
But, that was kind of the fun of it in many respects.
Well, I was going to say something like that. It was part of the job and you thrived on it.
Even if you were fulfilling all the expectations, though, then and now, your job could be gone when you come back in the afternoon after your lunch break. You could get laid off for no fault of your own. So I think that's part of the sense of hopelessness that people might feel in the job, that they can work their butt off. And I'm glad that you specified first-line editors, Judy, because I'm sure that you also include reporters, because the people out trying to get the stories are working, they're missing family events, they're working weekends, they're working nights. They're often putting in more hours than they're supposed to be putting in, more than they're being paid for with their meager salaries. because they have a personal commitment. They want to make sure that they're doing a great job or the best job that they can.
So
It
what
doesn't-
can you
doesn't pay
do,
off.
though? What can you do about it? Especially, you think about what some other professions do. Peer counseling. Well, there's less of that available now because people are not working in newsrooms and because the senior reporters have gone, as you say, to other better paying jobs, perhaps. And this is, by the way, laying aside the burnout of people who are in war zones and confronted with calamity. I made a joke about PTSD, but literally for those people who are seeing horrible things all the time, which some local reporters do as well, if you're covering death and destruction and fire and homicides and so on.
I haven't been in a newsroom in a long time. Do you see any evidence of a reaction to the burnout issue, that the bosses are aware of it and are expecting less of their reporters?
I don't think people are expecting less. My impression is that, if anything, there isn't as much time to do much about it. We used to have social events for the newsroom, and that helps a lot. Our newsroom at the Times Union was famous for great potlucks. People would cook and bring in food, and that was actually helpful. And of course, from an editor's standpoint, it also keeps them right near their desk. They can get back.
I think,
Only
I'm
kidding.
sorry, Barbara, go ahead.
I was going to say part of being demoralized is that isolationism, I think, that occurs now. In answer to your question, Ira, I can think of anecdotally a longtime reporter for the Saratogian who left a few months ago for a communication job, not in media. And one of the issues was that there's no bricks and mortar place for the Saratogian or the Record anymore. So you miss that camaraderie that Rex was referring to, and peer counseling. It's a totally different type of work environment. You're working on your own, and you're depending on conversations or Zooms or phone calls hopefully with your editors.
Well, what I meant about less, this again is anecdotal to use your word, but I noticed when my newspaper, when the digital revolution began, the reporters were encouraged to take video in addition to everything else they were doing. I see much less use of video in the digital edition of my old paper now than there used to be. And I don't know the answer to this, but I'm wondering whether they said, look, we've got to make some choices, and this is something we're going to live without. And I don't know if you're experiencing any of those things.
Well, I think a lot of newsrooms now have specialists who are doing the audio and video editing.
Well, that's the old days.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm surprised to hear that because the age of the specialist seems to have disappeared.
Well, and also it's hard to sell around video ads. Probably the papers couldn't sell advertising around it. I think we have to lower our expectations a little bit of what we expect from journalists. And a lot of this is, in some respects, it's self-imposed, but we need to rethink what we cover and whether everything absolutely needs to be covered all the time. I mean, we just need to change because the pressure is just going to increase. And we offer a lot of training, for example, but what I hear from editors is, I don't have time to do a 1-hour Zoom. There's just no time. I mean, I think in some respects you have to make the time. There's never been enough time in a day for an editor or a reporter, but you have to sit back and think about and prioritize what's important and what's not.
And as far as the work hours for reporters and editors, getting a little bit back to that, I can remember somebody worked for me for a long time and then moved on to the Gazette, which would be a step up in pay and prestige and circulation, I guess. And one of the issues I remember having with that person was that they worked too many hours. And then, of course, when they leave, they're either not replaced at all or they're replaced by one person who's actually working the hours of one person. And so there's an unrealistic gain for a newspaper when people are putting in more than they're getting paid for. They're not considering time. Here's what the company thinks you ought to be putting in.
If people aren't taking the vacation that they are afforded, which is a frequent problem in newsrooms, and we probably all have done that as well, because there's a bit of this sense of, well, I can do that, that's what's expected of me, but there's a reason why we have vacations, and it's a good idea. And the problem is that when you have this affliction for journalists, it leads to cynicism. It leads to trouble getting started, low energy. It just leads to bad performance, and bad performance yields bad journalism.
One other thing I wanted to mention is another possible contributor to burnout is that people are so open now about hating the press and not trusting the press. And to be a victim of that kind of outward disdain that's got to be demoralizing to be out there.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point.
Well, I would say, to piggyback on what Judy mentioned, is we always had to decide we didn't have enough people to cover everything we wanted to keep, even in the days what we might describe as full staff. And so now those decisions again about what we're going to cover or what we're not going to cover are more than ever come into play. And it just seems to me that once you've decided what you want to cover, even if it's far less than what you'd like to cover, only go with what you're going to cover, but do it as best you can. Produce something in your work that is so thorough, so unique, so fulfilling that people will want to read it and they'll buy your newspaper or whatever outlet you're working for.
Kristen Here's article touched upon it's not just journalists who suffer burnout, but lots of professions. And I think that she cited specifically educators and first responders.
Yeah,
and that there's
like,
a lot of similarities.
Medical professionals, nurses, and so on.
Sure, and there might be things that journalism can learn from those other professions of how they are trying to help their crews.
We used to say that there was a great similarity institutionally between hospitals and newspapers, we thought, because we each existed in the spot where errors are intolerable. And there are hierarchy of care, in effect, that we're supposed to watch over that. But when you make mistakes, because you can't give up on a patient, you have to keep going no matter what the time frame is. And the same thing is true of a story. But eventually, that kind of an intolerance to human emotions and problems that are confronting those frontline responders, reporters, doctors, nurses, can yield great calamity.
In our case, we think democracy is our patient, and we feel guilt if we're not covering every single board meeting. And we have to realize it's not our fault. It's, we can't be out there selling the newspapers. We can't be out there selling the advertiser. We can only do what we can do. And I think we can't fix the business model by ourselves. And once you accept that, I think it makes life a little less anxious for reporters on the job.
I like what you say, though, and this gets to one of the other key topics here about democracy being our patient. We've talked some in this program about the formulation that I think Jay Rosen, the professor of journalism at NYU, has said we need to focus on the stakes, not the game, right? That in covering especially democracy and politics this year, we really can't allow coverage of how this campaign is going, who's on top, who's not, to be the dominant theme. The dominant theme has to be that voters are choosing what kind of a democracy we're going to have, right? And I think that has to be part of every story you see, and we often don't get that. We get instead, well, here's an example. I mean, one of the things we want to talk about here is that during the next Republican debate, next week as we speak, which is only likely to have Ron DeSantis and Nikki Haley on stage, Fox has decided to counter-program with a town hall featuring Donald Trump. The debate's going to be on CNN, and on Fox, you're going to have Donald Trump. Guess
did Fox decide that, or did Donald Trump decide that?
Well, it sort of doesn't matter. Fox is the House organ, right?
Yeah.
And guess which one's going to get the higher ratings? So we need to look at that as not just campaign. That has implications for democracy, doesn't it?
Well, he's thumbing his nose at democracy. I mean, anytime you have an opportunity to hear from candidates being asked difficult questions is important for voters to make up their minds. And here's Trump stepping on the opportunity for people to listen to the other two candidates.
It's not just Trump doing it. It's Fox doing it. Fox doing it for money and to help them have the president that they now, once again, apparently want in office. It's frightening.
But they're doing it because he generates the audience, don't you think?
Oh, exactly why.
Yeah.
As we sit here now, all we hear about is horse race coverage. Who's ahead in the polls in New Hampshire? Who's ahead in the polls in Iowa? How does Biden match up against Trump? It's just incessant. And where do either of these candidates stand on issues? Who knows? And one of the problems with this kind of stakes approach, or this kind of horse race approach, is it feeds upon itself. It's lazy reporting. It's easy enough to rip off a story about, here's some numbers. We're going to do this again. We're going to write about, who's ahead and who's behind, how much they've gained among what kind of voters. But we're not going to talk about what issues are driving those kind of results and emphasizing the fact that it's just a poll at a moment in time. And I sometimes think the polls have been the ruin of democracy.
Yeah, well, I think you may be right, because that is one of the things that makes us focus on the odds, not the stakes. We like this. It's something you can latch onto. It's an easy story to do. Oh, who's ahead? Who's behind?
But I've talked about this in a different setting. But the problem that Judy describes is mainly being created by the cable networks and the repetitive nature of cable. They've got to fill programming. They've got to repeat the news every hour or so. The same stories that you and I would both bemoan being run regarding polls are still being run in other news outlets, specifically print. But they're on page 13. They're not dominating a half hour of discussion. Yes, they're being reported. Here's what the poll is, but generally speaking, they're not. And once you read them, you're gone for the day from them. It's the repetitive nature of broadcast, cable news in particular, that has laid the foundation of the kinds of ills that I think we all agree need addressing.
Yes, but what really worries me is Fox News, if there ever was an oxymoron for a name, is intentionally preventing a huge swath of the population from hearing anything but the propaganda.
And it's essentially giving Trump a commercial. It's an hour and a half commercial,
Exactly.
free airtime. They're not going to ask him any hard questions. I think whether or not the Haley DeSantis debate is a actual real debate, what value it will have. At least it will have a little bit more value than whatever show they put on Fox.
Yeah, I'm not really interested in the Haley and DeSantis. I think that's ridiculous also. Not also, but I don't think that's something that people are going to really benefit from watching.
By the way, just to note that this Fox town hall featuring Donald Trump will be co-moderated by Bret Baier and Martha McCallum. They are two people who are supposedly journalists at Fox News. Fox aficionados often say, well, they're the commentators like Sean Hannity, but that's like your newspaper editorial page, and then they're real journalists. No, there are not.
Well, we will see, won't we?
We will see. Yes.
You know whether that's going to be live or are they going to be editing it? Mm-hmm. It's going to be live.
It's going to be live, and he's going to be able to run away with it. And it's not at all like a real journalist who is the guy, a CNN anchor whom I hadn't heard of, Boris Sanchez.
Yeah, he's relatively new.
Was on the air with the chair of the Republican Party in Maine, and asked her, why is it that it's wrong for Maine to kick Donald Trump off the ballot under the 14th Amendment? And she didn't answer it, and so he asked again, and she didn't really answer it, so he asked again. 7 times he asked and never got an answer, but I think he made the point that she was evading the answer. Now that is, I think, what a journalist needs to do in a situation where you have politicians who won't answer your questions. And I don't think Bret Baier and Martha McCallum, who pose as journalists, are going to be doing that.
Can you refresh my memory? Was Fox News one of the sponsors, hosts of one of the prior presidential GOP debates?
I think, didn't they?
I thought that they were.
Right, didn't they take Trump out to lunch trying to convince him to participate in the debate?
That's what I thought. And yet here,
unsuccessfully?
when it's another station
Right.
Hosting a debate, they put on counter-programming.
Yep.
Worse than counter-programming.
So if you're just joining us, this is the Media Project from Northeast Public Radio. I'm Rex Smith. That was Barbara Lombardo you just heard, Ira Fussfeld, and Judy Patrick. We are some veteran local journalists who have some thoughts about what's going on in the media generally, and we ask you to share with us. media@wamc.org is our email address, and you're certainly welcome to join us. I want to bring up Jeffrey Epstein because, we like to do sensational stories around here. We talk Trump, we talk Epstein, but I'm worried about this because a couple hundred names that are connected to the sex trafficking conspiracy that involve Jeffrey Epstein are being released, and it seems to me that we have this hazard of getting caught up in a story of guilt by association. That is, yes, it's newsworthy who's on the Epstein list, who is it who actually saw Jeffrey Epstein, but we don't really know what was going on there, and I'm a little bit concerned because, journalists and politicians hang out with people, spend time with people, sometimes people who are of ill repute, and they don't necessarily engage in those activities.
Just so that for the reader's benefit, Jeffrey Epstein is a businessman who was a convicted pedophile who had committed suicide, and he had an island, a private island, where he took people, both his victims and VIPs. And so the suggestion that I think you're trying to make is that the names on this list may have well been involved with Epstein, but had nothing to do with what Epstein was convicted of.
And that's what concerns me. And it's hard to get that across in a story that just lists the names. Oh, yeah, of course, we know that Prince Andrew is going to be on there because there's been a lot written about his apparent predilection for engaging in some of this.
I have a confession to make. I've never been there. Nobody I know has been on his island.
Oh.
My confession would be, if I were still running a newspaper, that I would be kind of looking forward. I would be preparing to publish those names.
Right.
And part of it is like with the list, would it be salacious? Is it salacious? Is it disappointing because the names are not new? I think that there is newsworthiness, but as you're saying, Rex, you have to be able to put those names in context. But what I read about the impending release of the names is that there really isn't going to be any surprises, that anybody whose name is being published has already been mentioned in some way, shape, or form in all the proceedings, public records that have been revealed so far.
Right.
So far, the traditional media has done a fairly good job of putting this all in context. The first release didn't have a list per se. It had references to people throughout the hundreds of pages that were released. So there was no real list, but it was no real surprises there. Julie Brown, the Miami Herald reporter who is credited with bringing Epstein to justice, I follow her and her reporting on it, and she likes to make the point in this media frenzy about the names, let's not lose sight of the fact that what was happening was pedophilia, that Jeffrey Epstein was victimizing girls that were 12, 13, 14, and there's some real crimes because what you're seeing on social media, a lot of joking around, a lot of false accusations, and a lot of condemning people by association, which Rex mentioned earlier. You have to put it in context. Former President Clinton's name is in the documents. Former President Trump's name is in the documents. But you need to find the context. It's not like they were on a list that of party animals. That's not. And I think the traditional media so far, it's early in the game, is doing a good job of doing that.
I would agree because even what I'd been reading about it, so President Clinton, President Trump's names were mentioned, and it clarifies in whatever article I was following up on.
A couple of paragraphs later.
Yeah, that they were not certainly involved in the stuff that was.
So you're sitting at your desk in Saratoga Springs, and somebody of authority who you trust comes in, and here's the list. There's 100 names on it. Do you print it? Do you look to see if there's any local names on it? Or do you say, okay, there's a list. All we know is he went to this island with this guy, but it doesn't mean he engaged in any of the transgressions. What is our responsibility as mainstream journalists regarding having a copy of this list?
Well, I would definitely look for local connections.
That's our redoubt. Yes.
Every story is a local
All right,
story.
so you found that the mayor of one of your townships is on that list. Doesn't suggest he did anything or she did anything.
But then we could try to contact that person and find out. Go knock on their doors.
Okay, so now you've done that. You've asked the questions and you write the story. Do you think your readers will say, okay, that settles that, or are they going to say, oh, guilt by association?
That is a danger of this profession. What you're suggesting, yes, guilt by association is a terrible thing that can happen to people.
So if we know that we do that, what should we be doing then?
What's a mayor of a small town in Saratoga County doing flying to this island?
My examples are not precise.
But it is difficult.
Excuse me. Although
it's a real
Saratoga
problem,
Springs, you have a lot of rich people who go to the racetrack.
Sure.
Oh, yes.
Wouldn't be surprised if many of them
Streets
are
are
on the
paved
list.
with gold.
Yeah.
As our former owner used to tell us.
One of the difficulties of covering Saratoga Springs, of course, is because the vulnerable voices, the poor folks, often don't get noticed, or they do perhaps by the media locally that aren't picked up by those who are just out of town and only see it as a horse racing
This
capital.
is true, but so you were a publisher. What would you do?
I would be very conflicted about it. I mean, we have these names of people who may or may not be in our community, and whether or not they're in our community, are we simply going to regurgitate the names without having any idea whether they ought to be regurgitated?
Yeah, I think that's
Epstein
a
made a lot
legitimate
of money
question.
doing what I presume was legal business entirely apart from his transgressions. And so it's certainly possible that you could have had dealings with Epstein that had nothing to do with what he got in trouble for.
Well, a lot of papers across the country that would get this information would be getting it from a higher source, so probably from the Associated Press or from the New York Times and its wire services,
Well, I
or
would
the
think that the
Washington Post.
Associated
And then
Press-
we would hope that for the overall names, that the people that the smaller publications are relying on, that they've done some of that vetting of what the list is about. They're not just providing it cold.
Okay, then. We
I
are
should have been
going to
watching the
have to
time.
make that the
Are
last.
you
told you we
serious?
gotta
Are
be
we?
more than an
Wow.
We go from
This was show 1701 and
Wow.
2.
we go from burnout to Jeffrey Epstein, and we get a little bit of beating up on Fox News in the middle of it. That's good. That's all. Ira Fussfeld is there. Barbara Lombardo, Judy Patrick, and I'm Rex Smith. Thanks to our producer David Gustina, and to you folks for joining us this week on the Media Project.
Poor old Sadie's on ting-a-ling-a-ling city desk. Hold the press, extra, extra, read all about it. It's a mess, meets the test. Oh, newspapermen meet such interesting people. Like the richest girl who could not bake a cake. Ting-a-ling, ting-a-ling, ling-a-ling-a-ling. Now, newspapermen are such interesting people. They used to work like hell just for romance.
The Media Project is a national production of WAMC, Northeast Public Radio. This week's projectors include former Times Union editor and current Substack columnist of the Upstate American, Rex Smith, Judy Patrick, former editor of the Daily Gazette and vice president for editorial development for the New York Press Association, Barbara Lombardo, the former editor of the Saratogian and a journalism professor at the University at Albany, and Ira Fussfeld, publisher emeritus of the Daily Freeman. You can listen to the Media Project anytime at WAMCpodcast.org or anywhere you get your podcast. I'm your producer, David Gustina. Thanks for listening.
Now, publishers are such interesting people. Their policy's an acrobatic thing. They claim to represent the common people. It's funny, Wall Street never has complained. Ah, but publishers have worries, for publishers must go to working folks for readers and to big shots for their dough. Now, publishers are such interesting people. It could be prostitution, I don't know. Ting-a-ling-a-ling, circulation, ting-a-ling-a-ling, advertising, get those readers, get that payoff. What a headache, what a mess. Oh, publishers are such interesting people. Let's give 3 cheers for freedom of the press.